damn, 20,000 subscribers! At this rate in which the channel is growing, I'm gonna literally have to take my hat off to all of you and reveal who I am. Well, we'll cross that bridge when we reach 30,000 subscribers, but in the meantime, who's up for some more Fire Emblem? At this point, I've covered so much about Fire Emblem that you'd think there's not much else to talk about, right? Well, actually, I've got plenty more Fire Emblem videos planned, so I'm not running out of ideas anytime soon. And also, there is one key aspect of the game that I feel needs more attention: the weapons. Since Fire Emblem is all about war, weapons are a big part of the gameplay, and with a franchise spanning over 25 years and 15 games, there's been a large amount of weapons throughout the series, some good and some bad. But seeing as today is a day of celebration, let's say we look at the best weapons, shall we? So join me everyone, as it's time to celebrate reaching 20,000 subscribers, and I've got two lists counting down my 15 favourite weapons in this series, with this particular video being focused on normal weapons and legendary weapons coming next. Before we begin, let me just set a few things straight. Naturally, this is all just my opinion, and keep in mind I said favourite weapons, not the best weapons, since while it's easy enough to simply list the strongest weapons stat-wise, I decided to take a more creative approach and list what weapons I like the most for a number of different reasons. So remember, favourite weapons, not best. For those wondering, forged weapons don't count, and weapons that are either exclusive to a certain character or S rank level do not count as well. They're part of the next list. And with all that cleared up, it's time for me to show my love for all of you once again, and considering actions speak louder than words, I feel these 15 weapons have a lot to say. Wardell. Starting off with a weapon that's pretty much made for their respective class, the Wardell is an ideal sword for Myrmidons, and it's pretty much the go-to weapon for them early on. While this weapon's potency starts to fade further into the game, there's no denying just how awesome these things are, and they can certainly make Myrmidons quite the force to be reckoned with. Wardell is essentially a killing edge, only with less damage, more accuracy, and higher critical hit. While I don't find these as good as the killer weapons, and not helped by the fact that only Myrmidons can use them, they're still pretty good weapons, as Myrmidons will easily land critical hits with them, and characters like Fur and Mia will start with these weapons, so they can be landing criticals straight out the gate, and even then their base power for an early game weapon is rather solid. As the game goes along, their potency starts to dwindle, as their low damage will end up being a hindrance even when landing critical hits, and there are other weapons that come along that just do an overall better job. Despite this, I still like the Wardell, especially during the early game, allowing Myrmidons to do what they do best and just crit, crit, crit for days. Raider weapons. Now this one is certainly an odd choice, since these are some of the weakest weapons in Fire Emblem Fates, but strength isn't everything, since these weapons are actually really useful in the early game of each pathway, and can actually make for great weapons to use when you reclass a unit and they're stuck with the lowest weapon rank, and considering the weapons you're limited to with an E rank, this thing is pretty good. The Raider weapons are kinda like joke weapons, as they strip the enemy of their clothes when attacked if the user has a weapon advantage, which I'll admit is pretty damn funny. Though I wonder how it would work on Charlotte. I mean, she's barely wearing anything to begin with. Aside from making the enemies drop their pants, these weapons have the additional effect of increasing the chance to double by 3. This I find to be the main appeal of this weapon, as I tend to use these weapons a lot in the early game, and having a better chance to double when your units are lacking in stats is very beneficial. Plus, there aren't exactly that many good weapons to use at E rank level anyway, so this is pretty much the best option you got. Despite being rather silly, the Raider weapons have their perks, and for a while, they're one of the more useful weapons to use before you start to bulk up, so best to think of these things as training wheels. Range tomes. I bet you're all thinking, Blazing Knight, what are you talking about? All tomes have a minimum of 1 to 2 range, so are you including every tome in the series in this spot? Not exactly. When I say range tomes, I'm talking about the tomes that have the ability to hit allies from up to 10 spaces away. Most of these tomes have a reputation for being used against you and the frustration that comes with it, but actually being able to use one of these for yourself is quite the experience. Ranged tomes like Bolting and Tornado are tomes that have the ability to hit enemies between 3 to 10 spaces away and deal a very hefty amount of damage. Though rather rare and mostly used against you, these tomes make for some great ways to pick off units at a safe distance and weaken some of the tougher enemies. The major downside to these tomes is their low ammo and high weight, making them hard to double with or land many hits to begin with, unless it's Binding Blade where these things only weigh 10, making doubling much easier. And if you give these tomes to one of your best mages, then you can deal a hefty blow to even the strongest of enemies, so be sure not to pass up the opportunity to deliver death from a distance. Blessed weapons. Sometimes Fire Emblem games will have unique classes or enemies to go alongside the typical cannon fodder. In this case, Gaiden and Awakening had things like monsters and revenants. While they weren't exactly cause for concern, the blessed weapons were designed to help combat them, but even then, in Awakening, their ordinary base stats are more than enough to make them useful against regular units, and they even have their own bonuses to go alongside it. Guess these weapons really are a blessing. Blessed weapons are essentially holy weapons that are super effective against monster-like enemies. Admittedly, that doesn't sound like much, since those types of enemies aren't too dangerous, but hey, every little helps, and they have more uses outside of just extra damage. For one thing, they restore HP at the start of every turn when equipped, 5 in Gaiden and 10 in Awakening. And on top of that, in Awakening, blessed weapons still have strong stats across the board, and don't punish you like certain other weapons do for using them against regular units. So essentially, what you have here are strong weapons that are even stronger against monsters and can heal you as well. Currently, I see no downside to this. While not outstanding weapons, and certainly more favourable in Awakening, I'm still grateful for blessed weapons, and the small bonuses they give you can be more helpful than you think. So insert your blessing analogy here, because I've done more than enough at this point. Beast/Dragonstone Plus. Beast units in Fire Emblem don't exactly have a lot of weapons. I mean, once they're transformed via their stones, they're pretty much good to go, so having a stone that makes them stronger pretty much speaks for itself. Beast/Dragonstone Plus, or whatever variation depending on the unit, are essentially stronger versions of their standard shifting stones that allow the units to hit much harder than before. Naturally, there are downsides to this weapon, and in this case, it varies between Awakening and Fates, since in Awakening, every stat gets boosted even further. However, these stones only have 35 uses compared to 50, and only 70 accuracy. And in Fates, the boosted stats are even stronger, however the reduced stats are even weaker, so they can be quite the double-edged sword. Despite these setbacks, I've always found the Plus stones to be superior, and this is much more noticeable towards the endgame, where the normal Beast stones just won't cut it anymore, and you really feel the power of those stat boosts. At the end of the day, while the normal stones are still great, the Plus versions are overall better in my eyes, having higher risks but also higher rewards, and those rewards are the sweet taste of the enemy's blood. Isn't that right, Keaton? Celicas Gale. Anyone who's played Fire Emblem Awakening knows just how broken magic was in that game, wind magic in particular due to its effectiveness against flying units. With this in mind, my favourite wind tome in the game was easily Celicas Gale, as this little baby is able to destroy any unit that is unfortunate enough to cross books or blades with whoever wields this tome, which in most cases is Robin, for obvious reasons. Celicas Gale is very much like a brave variation of a wind tome, allowing the user to naturally land 2 consecutive hits, which can then be increased to 4 if the user is fast enough. This alone makes the weapon great, helped by the fact that A, this is a wind tome which is arguably the best type of tome in the game, B, the fact that magic in Awakening is pretty much broken so this weapon can wreck all kinds of shit, C, it has 80% accuracy which is pretty damn good, and D, the rank for this weapon is level C, making it easy for the majority of mages to use this right from the get-go. Granted, the weapon isn't perfect since its base damage is actually pretty poor, only having 4 might, and it only has 20 uses, but even with those downsides, this tome is still awesome. Being a standout tome in Awakening isn't easy considering I'm otherwise spoiled for choice in this game, but Celicas Gale is more than capable of standing out, and I'm not just talking about its battle properties, there's something else about this that sounds familiar. Wait a minute. Celicas Gale. As in, that Celica? Motherfucker, they were hinting at it all this time! Guard Naginata. Along with many new classes, Fire Emblem Fates introduced a lot of exotic new weapons as well, with the Guard Naginata being a personal favourite of mine. While the Norian Blade does something similar, I've always found the Guard Naginata to be superior. In fact, it was my go-to weapon for the majority of spear users, as well as helping to make up for something most Birthright units lacked in. No, sadly, this did not give them a personality. The Guard Naginata is a lance weapon with the added benefit of increasing the user's defense and resistance by 5. Considering I'm more of the defensive Fire Emblem player, this weapon was just perfect for me, as whoever I gave this weapon to allowed them to hold down choke points and tank the enemy with ease. It didn't matter if it was a physical attack or a magical attack, this weapon made sure that no attack was too much to shrug off. This was made better by the fact that most Birthright units don't exactly have the best defense, with a few exceptions, so this weapon helped to make up for what they lacked in. This weapon, while great for defense, isn't the best for attack since it's only got 5 might and it even drops your evasion by 10%, so it's not always great, and I can see the more offensive Fire Emblem players not really using this weapon. Thankfully, this is a favourites list, and the Guard Naginata just so happened to be one of my favourite weapons in Fates. Man, despite the flaws, this game does so much right. Class Killer Weapons. While they each have their own names, the Class Killer Weapons all have one primary function: to absolutely destroy a specific class, and destroy is no joke, as these weapons allow just about any unit to one-shot certain classes, and can make taking down some of the tougher enemies and bosses much easier, and though they're somewhat situational, when they're useful, they're damn useful. Class killer weapons do what they say on the box. They're super effective weapons against particular classes. For example, Armor Slayers kill Knights, Beast Slayers kill mounted units, Lagoose Slayers kill Lagoos, you get the idea. This pretty much speaks for itself in just how useful these weapons are, as just about any unit using them can kill the opposing class in 1 or 2 hits, even if the enemy is of a much higher level. With this in mind, these weapons are best saved for bosses, hordes of the same class coming at you, and some of the tougher enemy units, as it will make mincemeat of them. However, when used against just about any other unit, these weapons aren't so great, as they tend to have very low hit and high weight as well, so be sure to use them at the right place and at the right time. Despite being pretty situational, class killer weapons can make even the strongest of enemies crumble before you, and allow some of the worst units to become temporary powerhouses. Just look at what Wendy can do when she's given a Horse Slayer. Ah, such a beautiful sight. Magic melee weapons. Much like the previous entry, these weapons go by many names, but they function otherwise the same, acting as melee weapons with magical properties. While that may sound strange, it's more useful than you think, and can allow certain units to make excellent use out of these weapons, so while pretty niche, their potency is nothing to scoff at. Magic melee weapons, as I like to call them, are weapons that allow the user to deal magical damage while using physical weapons like the Levin Sword, the Poleaxe, the Shock Stick, and so on. These weapons can surprise you in just how good they are, as they are very potent against enemies with low resistance, and also allow units more versatility to the way they fight. Admittedly, these weapons are only really useful for units with a decent magic stat, so they are rather niche, but their base power is pretty good, and certain characters like Robin, Anna, Camilla, Nina, and so on can really make good use out of these weapons, plus the weapon can attack from both long and short range, and that's nice. True, these weapons are rather limited in how good they can be, and in each game they tend to have greatly different battle properties, heck in fates they can't even crit. But I still love them, and they can really surprise the enemy and turn the tide of battle, and in Robin's case, otherwise solo the game. It's no wonder he brought that thing to Smash Bros. Silver weapons. Pretty much a staple of the Fire Emblem series, silver weapons are a high class of weapon commonly used in the last third of the game because of just how powerful they are. They hit hard, don't weigh too much, aren't too difficult to come across, and don't have any major penalties, so you really can't go wrong with these weapons. Most of the time. Silver weapons are essentially the strongest variation of the standard Fire Emblem weapons. While their stats vary depending on the game, they often have high might, good accuracy, and rather low weight as well, so you pretty much can't go wrong with them. Heck, in Genealogy you can get one really early and watch Sigurd wreck all kinds of shit. While other weapons have added bonuses, the silver weapons are straightforward and simple with no major downsides. In fact, for the longest time the only problem with these weapons was that they were rather expensive and didn't have that much ammo, but even then it was a minor setback for such awesome weapons. Until Fire Emblem Fates. Yes, I'm going to open that can of worms, but I'm sorry, the silver weapons in Fates fucking sucked! No one in their right mind would use them since they reduced your critical evade by 5 and both your strength and your skill by 2, making them effective against just one enemy per turn, and that was about it. In fact, most people just stuck to the steel weapons, they sucked so much. In every other case though, these weapons are some of the best you could get in any Fire Emblem game, so be sure to use them whenever you get the chance, because you won't be disappointed. Most of the time. Reverse weapons. The weapon triangle is a huge part of Fire Emblem's gameplay, and knowing the ins and outs of this mechanic is the key to victory. However, these weapons turn the concept on its head. Literally. Reverse weapons essentially turn weapon advantages into disadvantages, and can make otherwise dangerous enemies and bosses into complete pushovers, and while this can work against you, most of the time, the odds will be in your favour. As the name suggests, reverse weapons act as weapons that turn the weapon triangle against itself. While they all have different names depending on the game, like the Reaver weapons, dual weapons and so on, they all function otherwise the same. So now swords beat lances, lances beat axes, and axes beat swords, etc. With that knowledge, it's easy to see why these weapons are so useful, as enemies wielding one type of weapon are otherwise helpless against you, and these weapons are ideal for bosses most of the time. I also find that these weapons are great for classes that are locked into using a single weapon, as it allows them to tackle a wider variety of units and be overall more potent than before. However, these weapons are a double-edged sword, as the reverse weapon triangle can backfire on you, and I often find that these weapons are more of the situational sort, as like I said before, they're best suited for mainly bosses. Knowing the ins and outs of the game's mechanics is often the key to success, but being able to turn those mechanics on its head can be even more beneficial, and that's what the reverse weapons are for, as they can literally tip the scales. Steel Great Lance and Poleaxe. This one really is down to favoritism, but holy crap, I love these two weapons in particular. Throughout Radiant Dawn, these weapons would often be used on a wide variety of units, and to be honest, most of the time that's all they needed until the endgame. While yes, these weapons have their downsides, the amount of good that came out of using them was no joke, and in a game like Radiant Dawn, these things are literal lifesavers. The Great Lance and Poleaxe are essentially advanced versions of the standard Steel Lance and Axe in Radiant Dawn, and out of all of these versions, I found the steel ones to be my favourite. While some may cry foul since they have the highest weight to them and the silver versions are overall superior, let's look at this from a different perspective. Starting out, you can get these weapons as early as the endgame of Part 1, and they appear very often from Part 2 and onwards, whereas you don't get the silver weapons until around the end of Part 3, and while yes, there's the iron versions even earlier, they're not that good since I find the standard steel weapons to make for better options. Throughout Radiant Dawn, I would use these weapons as much as I could, and holy hell did they serve me well. Pretty much every unit that used them ended up doing really well regardless of the enemy, thanks to their very high damage output, along with decent ammo and accuracy. And in a game like Radiant Dawn, this was a godsend. I mean seriously, just give Nephany a Steel Great Lance, Titania a Steel Poleaxe, or hell, give Eva to Ha, and watch as these weapons will almost never need to be switched out, because they are so damn good, and I will use them as much as I can every time I play through Radiant Dawn. Nosferatu. Dark tomes in Fire Emblem are naturally very potent and most of the time they do more than just damage to the enemies, with Nosferatu being my favourite of these tomes. While it didn't stand out too much in the GBA era or even the Tellius series, Awakening is where this tome really began to shine, and it was so good that you could solo the game with Eva Dark Mage using just this tome. Such a shame it was nerfed in Fates, but hey, you can't win them all. The tome Nosferatu is a dark tome with the added effect of draining the enemy's HP and transferring it to yourself. While the effect of this tome varies depending on the game in question, I think it's pretty obvious why this tome is so good. Being able to absorb the enemy's HP is great in of itself, but this tome also helps to make up for one of the Dark Mage's biggest flaws due to how frail they are, which is fantastic when Dark Mages are out on the front lines, and sometimes they can outright one-shot the enemies and drain all of their HP. In the GBA and Tellius era, this tome was good, without a doubt, but it wasn't amazing. In Awakening, however, this tome was just downright disgusting, and most players can agree that this was pretty much all you needed to give either Tharja or Henry. Granted, this tome isn't perfect since it tends to have low accuracy and high weight, so if you miss with this tome, you're pretty fucked, so make sure you've got the stats to back it up. Dark tomes are some of the most powerful and fun tomes to mess around with, and I think it's pretty clear why Nosferatu is my favourite. In fact, it was so good that Robin used it in Smash Bros, and he's not even a Dark Mage. That fucking cheater. Killer weapons. There is nothing more satisfying than landing a critical hit in Fire Emblem, and the killer weapons make landing criticals otherwise second nature to most units. This alone makes them great weapons, but even if they fail to land crits, their base power is often enough to make them deal some hefty damage, and they're actually rather common in most Fire Emblem games, so feel free to critical to your heart's content. Killer weapons act as weapons with an average of 20 to 30% critical hit, along with around 9 might, 8 weight, and about 75% accuracy. Now 20 to 30% critical may not sound like much on paper, but it's more useful than you think, since you'll be surprised just how often units in Fire Emblem will land criticals even with these numbers, and given to the right class like a Swordmaster, Assassin or Berserker, the chance of landing a critical hit would just skyrocket, and they'll pretty much one-shot the enemy every single time. This makes killer weapons great to use at just about any point in the game, and you'd be a fool not to use them whenever possible. Plus, I often find them very useful against bosses and some of the tougher enemies in the game. Additionally, even if these weapons don't land criticals, their base stats of these weapons are still really solid and prove to be rather potent when just used about anyone. In fact, Fates arguably made them better by increasing the damage dealt from landing critical hits from 3 times the damage to 4 times the damage. Needless to say, Charlotte found herself a new best friend. Regardless of what Fire Emblem game you're playing, the killer weapons will always be some of the best in the game and useful in just about any situation. So what could possibly top that? Well, let's find out. Brave weapons. Yeah, you all saw this one coming, but honestly, can you blame me? Brave weapons are just so damn good they can sometimes outclass even the legendary weapons, so it makes sense that they'd be number 1. Whenever you find one of these in any Fire Emblem game, you can be damn sure that it will result in the enemy's demise, so be sure to give them to your best units and watch as they just beat the game for you. What makes the Brave weapons so special is that they have the ability to automatically double the enemy regardless of the unit's stats. Now that in of itself is pretty awesome, but if one of your units is already fast enough to double the enemy naturally, then the Brave weapons will allow you to deal a quadruple attack. What else needs to be said? 4 consecutive attacks? Hell yes! With all this power at your disposal, there won't be any enemy that can stand before you, and you're pretty much guaranteed to win before the enemy has a chance to retaliate. Adding to this, the Brave weapons often aren't that rare in Fire Emblem, being obtained often in the mid to late game, and these weapons themselves have an average of 10 might, 70 accuracy and 30 ammo, so their base stats, while not the best, are still more than enough to be incredibly potent, and while yes they got worse in Fate, I'm not too fussed since there's a greater sense of risk versus reward, seeing as they only allow 2 consecutive attacks when attacking rather than being attacked, whereas before you were always guaranteed to get 2 consecutive attacks, which made these weapons borderline OP. What else can I say? The Brave weapons are fucking awesome. While some weapons are better for certain situations, the Brave weapons will never let you down and can be so good they'll even outclass some of the legendary weapons, and it's for these reasons that they rank as my favourite normal weapons in the Fire Emblem series. This has been Blazing Knight. I wish you all a great night, take care, and now that I've covered the normal weapons, next time we meet, I'll be tackling something a bit more legendary. But what do all of you think? Did you agree with me? Did you disagree with me? What are your favourite normal weapons in the series? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel as well. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at BLAZINGKNIGHT and also follow me on Amino as well. Anyway, that's it from me. I'll see you all next time.